We will start in 2 minutes. Good morning, everyone. Bom dia a todos. My name is Brian Winter. I'm the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly. Thank you for joining us here this morning for this event about fake news and misinformation, which are really increasing problems all across the Americas, across all Western democracies, on the ideological left, on the right, and everywhere in between. Over the last year, we've seen some really absurd examples, from claims in Mexico that bananas can cure COVID to this image here from the cover of our new issue of America's Quarterly that purportedly showed Pope Francis smoking marijuana with Evo Morales, supposedly proof that the Argentine pontiff is really a decadent socialist at heart. Obviously, it was a fake image. And look, some of these images, some of these memes, some of these fake news, some of them are frankly quite funny, but the effect has been very corrosive. COVID-related misinformation, for example, has cost untold lives and may help explain why Latin America has accounted for 33% of the world's COVID-related deaths, despite having only 8% of the world's population. While other bits of fake news and misinformation have corroded faith in democratic institutions, including in elections, with 30% of Brazilians now saying they have moderate faith in their voting system, and an additional 19% saying that they have no faith at all, in an all-electronic system that has performed very well in recent years and is certainly better, in my opinion, than our system here in the United States. The risk as we head into this electoral cycle in the hemisphere over the next 12 months with elections in Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Honduras, and Brazil is clear. The question is whether we can do anything about it. Can governments, companies, civil society, and others act in a way that at least reduces the flow of fake news? And that's what we're here to talk about today. We're grateful to all of you joining us. This is a public event being webcast with a presence of media from all over the hemisphere as well. We're grateful to Google for providing support for today's event. And this is an event in two parts. The second will be a truly diverse panel of experts, but the first is a very special guest. Luís Roberto Barroso is a justice on the Brazilian Supreme Court. He's also the president of the Supreme Electoral Court and a true thinker of global relevance on this issue of misinformation and elections. He will give some initial remarks, and then we'll have a short conversation. Minister Barroso, you have the floor. You are on mute, I'm afraid.
Now.
Now.
Thank you very much. Ryan, it's a pleasure to be here. I greet everyone, and I thank you for the kind invitation. I have divided my initial remarks in three very brief chapters. First one is the digital revolution and the rise of social media. The second one is the phenomenon of disinformation and the means to face it. And the third one is the strategies adopted by the Brazilian Superior Electoral Court to deal with the problem. So starting with the digital revolution, we are all living under the third industrial revolution, which is the digital or technological revolution characterized by the massification of personal computers, of smart cell phones, and particularly the internet, connecting billions of people around the world. The internet has revolutionized the world of interpersonal and social communication, expanding exponentially the access to information, to knowledge, and to the public sphere. These days, anyone can talk to the world, conveying his or her opinions and conveying facts and ideas. The downside of the process is that it has also created an environment where crimes can be carried out, along with the propagation of hate speech, conspiracy theories, and disinformation or misinformation campaigns that have been nicknamed fake news. One of the most striking consequences of the digital revolution is the appearance of social media and messaging apps. Facebook these days has more than 3 billion accounts. YouTube has around 2.5 billion users, and WhatsApp over 2 billion. In Brazil, according to a survey conducted by the Senate, 79% of the population has WhatsApp as its main source of information, television coming in second place with 50%, followed closely by YouTube and Facebook. As you all know, at the beginning, there was a belief that the internet and the social media should be a space free from regulation, either economic, commercial, and the only perspective was preserving free speech. As you might remember, free, open, and unregulated were often repeated words. And I don't need to tell you all that this perception has changed dramatically. So this is our first brief chapter. Our second brief chapter deals with disinformation and social media control. So nowadays, there is a consensus that internet needs some sort of regulation dealing with economic issues like preserving copyrights, like finding the proper taxation for internet and applying antitrust legislation. The internet needs regulation to protect our rights of privacy, and there have been enacted laws dealing with this problem throughout the world. And the third consensus is that we need some kind of content control, and we need to establish some platform liability rules. And of course, when we talk about content control, we need to be aware of the importance of free speech for democracy, and thus finding the proper balance is something that we are all paying attention right now. The regulation of social media should seek to curb unauthentic behavior in the first place, like the use of robos and trolls to make everyone think that everyone is talking about that issue at a certain moment. In the second place, we need to fight illicit content like terrorism, child abuse, and other crimes you can commit online. And finally, and that's the point that interests us the most, we need to fight disinformation, meaning the deliberate creation of and dissemination of false news, generally with the purpose of obtaining personal gain. So the whole world right now is trying to find the best way to regulate the internet and social media and messaging apps, and trying to strike a balance between legislation, between self-regulation, and between regulated self-regulation. And there is a certain consensus, I think, that the proper criteria for moderating content must include transparency, must include due process, and must include fairness. I'm not getting into details right now because Brian asked me to leave some time for a debate and exchange of ideas. So I'm being very brief. And so I get to my third chapter, which is the strategies adopted by the Superior Electoral Court of Brazil to deal with disinformation. Superior Electoral Court, the acronym is TSE, so I'm going to use it for short. In I would like to start with the 2018 elections, because those elections changed the pattern of the electoral scenario in Brazil. Until then, as many of you might know, access to television and radio, which is free in Brazil during the campaign, was the main feature of a campaign. And alliances were made and established so that the candidate would get the most time on radio and television. Well, in 2018, the candidate that had the longest period online placed fourth, as you all know. And something new happened in those elections. The winning candidate was the beneficiary of a great strategy of using social media and messaging apps. Such strategy included bulk messaging at voters, unsolicited, by the way, and along with spreading negative news about other candidates. And the truth is that the legislation, the case law, and the TSE were not prepared to deal with this situation, with this new reality, which also included attacks against the electoral system, which ultimately meant attacks on democracy. So when the 2020 elections came, Brian and everyone, we had done our homework and learned at least part of the lesson, and we prepared for a warfare operation against disinformation. We prepared for a warfare because first we had to convince people to come and vote in the midst of a pandemic. That was the first challenge. The second was to elaborate a health and sanitary plan and distribute protection equipments all over Brazil, which was no easy task, believe me. And in the third place, we prepared a very comprehensive plan to combat disinformation, especially the disinformation that aimed at the electoral process. And our program had three main axes: fighting information with accurate information and immediate responses. That was the first axis. The second axis was our priority was to focus on authentic behaviors rather than in content. And in the third place, media education of society. I'll mention very briefly a couple features of each of these axes, and then I'll close so that we have some time. As for the massive disclosure of true information, I always like to recall a quote by Cristina Tardáguila that's here with us. The best way to fight disinformation is flooding the market with accurate information. And we entered partnerships with all technological platforms with customized concrete action by each one of them. We entered partnerships with all major fact-checking agencies so that they could verify information and debunk fake news. And we created a page called Fact or Rumor at the Electoral Justice website, where we would convey truthful information that had been checked by the fact-checking agencies. We entered a partnership with all telecom companies so that people would have access to this page without having to pay a zero rating deal. And we had an agreement with all the platforms that they would give visibility to the link to our page that in fact had millions of accesses. As for control of unauthentic behaviors, our second axis, we entered equally partnership with all the platforms, and especially WhatsApp, which, as I mentioned, is very important in Brazil. And indeed, they banned 360,000 accounts for unauthentic behavior. We had a direct channel with WhatsApp for denouncing unauthentic behavior, and we created a coordination unit to combat disinformation. So we monitor the social media, and we would immediately respond to any fake news. And as for media education, we held a major campaign with a famous biologist and YouTuber that was on television and on radio for several weeks. And I myself recorded several videos that were broadcasting in social media explaining what fake news were and how to avoid disseminating it. So, Brian, this is very briefly, as you asked me, some comments I could make on how I see the problem of disinformation and how we try to fight it. And we do think that we won temporarily, at least, this fight. Of course, you don't eliminate fake news, but we were able to get 113 million people to vote in the midst of a pandemic. And I think we preserved to the largest extent possible the credibility of the system. And just to end, the president started the attacks against the system after the elections. And we think that we were able to win this battle also, not going back to paper vote, which has always been the proper scenario for frauds in Brazil. And according to Datafolha, 73% of the population rely on our electoral system, which is a pretty good achievement considering that for weeks, the president attacked every day the system, the electoral justice, and myself. So that's it to start with.
All right. Well, Minister Barroso, thank you so much for your thoughtful remarks. And what's clear is the determination of the authorities in Brazil to prevent these attacks on democratic institutions, on the confidence in the electoral system. And that, I think it's fair to say, is different from the posture that authorities had back in 2018, when some people criticized the Brazilian authorities for being too passive in the face of all of this kind of fake news and misinformation. You mentioned during your open remarks the balance between what you called content control and then the concerns about potentially infringing on free speech. And I tell you, I mean, we spent the last 3 months looking at this issue, and it's just so complex because if you give a lot of power to governments to make these decisions, then you run the obvious risk of silencing dissent. If you rely too heavily on companies to do it, I mean, that's an awful lot of power that goes to the private sector. So my question is, who in your mind, what mix of policies are necessary in order to achieve the best balance between those two factors?
Well, Brian, I live in Brazil, and so the ghost of my generation is censorship and government censorship. So we are very cautious when we deal with this issue, and we want as little state as possible in this matter, and as much as possible of regulated self-regulation. So I think we should have a legal framework, and then I think the platforms should be in charge of implementing these measures. And I would think, and that's a suggestion of my daughter Luna Barroso, is studying this matter and has just published her thesis on creating an independent agency, but really independent, including from the government. The government would have a representative, but it would not be the majority. And so we would have an independent agency monitoring the platforms to make sure that they are abiding by the legislation. And as I mentioned before, Brian, I think for moderating content, transparency is very important. So the terms of use should be very objective on the criteria they're going to be using. There should be some sort of due process, like I could appeal my banning of the internet, for example. And in the third place, it needs to be fair. Like you can't discriminate on political preferences or on sexual orientation, for example. So transparency, due process, and fairness within a framework defined by the government and monitored by an independent agency, I think would be a good idea to deal with this problem.
Another question, Minister, and this may be my last one, just because unfortunately we're out of time for this initial part of our event. But as someone who watches Brazil a lot, as you know, it seems like there's been an effort, even in the last few weeks, to try to build a certain jurisprudence on some of these issues ahead of the 2022 elections. One of your colleagues on the Supreme Court has spoken about the using imprisonment potentially as a tool for those who disseminate this bulk messaging that was a feature of the 2018 election that you mentioned during your initial comments. There have also been efforts to imprison some call him a blogger, some call him an influencer associated with the current government. And my question is, is prison, do you think it's an effective tool for punishing some of these transgressions when people are serially sharing fake news? Because I again, on this balance between freedom of speech and preventing this fake news, I have to confess it makes me a little bit nervous when we start talking about jail time for people as a result of sharing fake news.
Brian, I'm not very fond of criminal law to deal with certain issues, and especially issues that involve free speech. So I would say criminal law should be the last resort. My colleague was possibly mentioning the scenario that we faced in Brazil with very strong, articulated, and funded attacks against democracy, and for the closure of the Supreme Court and the closure of the Congress, and personal attacks to the justices. So I think he might be referring to something more serious when he mentioned that, but you would need to ask him. But I do think that the Electoral Court should, and we sent this sign, enforce very strictly the prohibition of bulk messages, especially containing fake news, and particularly against the electoral system. And that could lead to the cassation, to the loss of the mandate by whoever is elected. So I think we should again prepare for a war, and criminal law, I don't think, should be the main resource. It should be the last resort in extreme cases, but I do think we need to be strict. The major problem, as we all know here, is that it's not always easy and clear to establish what's fake news and what's disinformation. So we need to be very careful because we want a free and robust debate during the elections. So we are more concerned, Brian, about protecting the electoral system and democracy more than controlling the exchange of offenses, maybe, or whatever, between candidates. So our main goal is to protect democracy and the reliability of the electoral system. To avoid fake news among candidates, the electoral justice has a proper procedure that you can file a complaint in case of fake news being directed against you. So these are two things that we need to clearly separate: protecting democracy and the reliability of the system, but allowing a free, robust debate that we want it to interfere as little as possible.
I do have one more quick question, and we'll extend the event a little bit at the end if we have to. Mr. Barroso, you're a citizen of the world. You speak this exceptional English, which as somebody who tries to, speak Portuguese, it makes me embarrassed to hear how good your English is. But I mentioned this because none of this is taking place in a vacuum. And my question is, as you look around the world, is there any country or any environment that you think Brazil should try to follow? Is there any example elsewhere in the world where someone has successfully faced these issues, or do you think it's left to Brazil for kind of reasons for domestic reasons to be a pioneer on this issue?
I think we have been, Brian, a laboratory for many things, many ideas, including in judicial review and what we call constitutional jurisdiction. And I think in this matter, we are going to be the laboratory too. I think there are, if you look quickly, two extreme ways of holding platforms liable. The tendency in Europe, and I think in Germany, to hold the platform liable as soon as the interested party notifies the platform that something is untruthful and needs to be removed. And we have this Brazilian system, or you have the other extreme, the US system, in which, as far as I know, never there's been a court order determining the removal of any content. And in Brazil, we have this Marco Civil da Internet, which establishes that the platform should remove content after the first court order, except in a few cases, or actually except in one case, which is porn revenge. I think the only thing I would consider would be to enlarge a little bit the list of removals that should be taken down after the first notification of the interested party. But as a system, I do like the Brazilian system that is only after a court order, and I would just contemplate a few exceptions. How this is going to play out in an election like the disputed election in 2022, let's wait and see. But we're trying, again, to enter agreements, detailed agreements, with all the platforms to have clear criteria to avoid unauthentic behaviors and to remove content as fast as possible. I thought the experience we had with some of them of a direct channel by which the electoral court would ask for the removal, not exactly a court order, but just a communication that there seems to be something wrong. Please give a special consideration here. That could be a good idea also.
Minister Barroso, thank you so much for your thoughtful remarks, for your frank and direct answers, and for being with us today. You are, of course, more than welcome to stick around if your schedule permits as we move into the next portion of our event now, which is the panel. Thank you so much.
And then I'll have to, can I just exit without affecting the because I'm a co-host, right?
But yeah, that is a good question. There was some technical talk about that beforehand.
Okay,
I think
I'll
that
speak
you
as I
can.
can, and I'll stop the video and mute here. Don't worry, I won't.
Sounds good.
I won't
These are
take
the
you.
technical challenges that we have to face in late 2021. We'll see if maybe one of my colleagues can message you with specific instructions to ensure that we don't hold you prisoner for the next 40 minutes, although for what I'm sure will be a great discussion. So thank you, Minister Barroso, for joining us. We'd now like to go to what is an excellent, really top flight panel. Let me tell you who they are. We're joined today by Cristina Tardáguila, whom Minister Barroso mentioned. She is now the Senior Program Director of the International Center for Journalists. She's also the founder of Agência Lupa, which is Brazil's largest and oldest fact-checking agency. Also, Carlos Affonso Souza, who's the director of the Institute of Technology and Society of Rio de Janeiro and one of Brazil's leading experts on internet legislation. And finally, my friend Marcelo Lacerda, who's the director of government affairs and public policy for Google Brazil. Thank you to all of you for joining us. We went a little late with the keynote, but we'll prolong our discussion until about 10 minutes past the hour. Chris, I'd like to start with you. And before we get into this subject of solutions, I'd like to establish a little bit what we think the risks are under the current scenario. Essentially ask, how bad is this problem of misinformation in Brazil really? And of course, it's not just Brazil, but there is a reason why we focused on Brazil. I'll get into that a little later. But in our issue of America's Quarterly, which we just launched on this subject, we wrote about the profound and possibly terminal threat to democracy of the Americas all across the hemisphere posed by misinformation. Do you think we were exaggerating? What do you see happening in Brazil, and where do you think the risks truly are?
Hello, good morning, Brian. Hello, my friends. Mr. Barroso, it's always great to see you, and me too. Marcelo, Kaf. Well, I don't think you have exaggerated at all. We are facing a very big monster called misinformation and disinformation, right? And it's global. What I think that puts Brazil in a special situation is that we are in a very deeply polarized political scenario, which I don't really know if it's the cause or the consequence, right, of mis and disinformation. So we're heading to an election where we will be seeing different Brazil's fighting. When we did the research in 2018 with WhatsApp images that were shared by groups who were actually chatting about the campaign, we noticed that they were actually discussing two different Brazils. One that was actually missing the dictatorship and fearing what they thought would be Cuba or Venezuela, and the other one was actually fearing the dictatorship and wondering if we could finally become a Cuba or a Venezuela. So there's no conversation going on. And fake news, what they do actually, and I hate that expression, I'm sorry I keep saying this, it fuels the hate and the separation. And once people don't talk to each other, and then that's just impossible if society is not discussing issues and not questioning politicians about what they are really eager to do, but they are more worried about whether some meme on internet is true or false, then we're losing time.
Marcelo, let me come to you next. It became clear as we were putting this issue together that just what a battleground Brazil would be for a variety of reasons. As Chris mentioned, polarization is very high. There's also, let's just call things by their name. There's a government and people inside the government, people associated with the government who have a long record of sharing fake news with regard to Brazilian democracy, the electoral system, their political opponents, and so on. If the United States was kind of the main battleground with our election here in late 2020 and early 2021 for this debate over how to handle fake news in the world, is it reasonable to assume, do you agree that Brazil will be a major testing ground as we move into late 2021 and 2022?
Thank you, Brian. And first of all, thank you for the invitation. Also, I would like to, say hi to my colleagues, Justice Barroso, Cristina, and Carlos Affonso. It's a pleasure to be here. Brian, I think like for Google, we used to say that it's election every year, yes, because being a global company, we face election process every year, and I totally agree with the challenge, and of course next year, it's undoubtedly that the Brazilian elections will be a great focus for us, especially for the local team. But I do believe and I do agree with what Justice Barroso and Cristina just said about the complexity of dealing with this problem. Yes, and we at Google, we, as Justice Barroso also mentioned, we continue to believe that the internet, it's a huge gain to society. But however, like any tool, it can be misused by bad actors. Yes, and for us at Google, can be used by bad actors for many purposes. And I think that over the several past years, we saw this post-truth era becoming a subject of political debate. This concerns really affects Google because our mission is to organize the word information and make it useful and available for everybody. And when we see our platforms being used to share this type of information, that undermines also our ability, to fulfill this mission. Yes. What we see and what we have been doing here in Brazil for the also several past years since this debate started is to mainly, and I said this to Justice Barroso a couple of years ago, as mainly to partner with the TSE, with the Electoral Court, being this partnership the main pillar of our work during the elections. Yes, and this, what is the goal with that is, is to make sure that the users that goes to our platforms to use our platforms to had information about the electoral process could be able to find the more useful, official, and reliable information about the process. And for next year elections, that will be also our goal.
That's right, and thank you for that, Marcelo. Carlos, I mean, as I said in when I was introducing you, you're one of the leading experts on internet legislation and regulation in Brazil. As you look ahead to this election, which Marcelo just mentioned, and it's really, I mean, we live in a polarized world, but the two front runners in this election right now are, there's not a lot of love between those two figures or their support bases. And we've seen how in recent elections, when those two parties have faced off, there's been a lot of misinformation flying around. So how concerned are you? And does Brazil have the tools as things stand right now to try to do better on the misinformation front in 2022 than it did in 2018?
Well, first of all, thanks, Brian, for this very kind invitation to join this conversation, and especially a pleasure to discuss this issue among such experts and leading figures in this space. But I'll just say that I, as a Brazilian, of course, we have all the reasons to look towards the next year's election with some apprehension, because on one hand, of course, Brazil has been prepared to this election with the creation of certain legal reforms that end up addressing a lot of the issues that we've seen in the previous elections. But at the same time, we need to pay extra attention to the fact that the scenario might change. And when it comes to technology, and especially looking into internet regulation, we should always try to avoid looking into internet regulation through somewhat like a rear view mirror, in order trying to address the problems that we faced in the last election and not addressing what we right now could envision as the problems and the challenges that we are going to be facing in the next year's election. So this is always a dilemma when it comes to internet regulation. You try to fix the problems that happened in the past, and of course, addressing bulk messaging and the way in which disinformation was disseminated in the last election is, of course, a priority. But at the same time, right now, in late 2021, we already see the scenario changing a bit, in which we see the rise of different apps into the apps ecosystem. And of course, all the attention end up converging into Telegram as an app that its popularity in Brazil is spiking right now, and especially with the creation of groups that are way larger than the ones that you have on WhatsApp. And that is something that is causing the attention from regulators, especially because Brazil has just right now concluded a mixed parliamentary, sorry, not mixed, but a parliamentary inquiry commission on the consequences of the pandemic and all the requests that have been sent to Telegram end up not being responded by the company. So if that alone is not a clear sign of what might happen in the future, that is something for us that definitely need to pay attention. And I would just conclude, Brian, saying that even though I think there is a lot of good work being put on the sending of bulk messaging, addressing coordinated, inauthentic behavior, we need to pay extra attention of those new challenges that we are already mapping in the scenario. And I'm really looking forward to see how policymakers and regulators will address that, especially because 2022, it's already around the corner.
Oh, so let's talk about that. Let's get to what to me is the most interesting part, which is the possible solutions. And as I said in my conversation with Minister Barroso, I came away from this 3 months focused on this subject almost with more questions than answers, and a clear feeling that there's no silver bullet for dealing with this issue. I mean, yes, I believe we spoke earlier in the event about flooding the zone with quality information, but fact-checking agencies can do some of that. And Chris, that's the world that you came from. But as you said on our America's Quarterly podcast last week, out of 210 million Brazilians, there are only about 50 or 60 professional fact-checkers. So clearly we can't ask for that group of people to do all the heavy lifting. And if you look at some of the legislation that's being proposed, not just in Brazil, but in other countries around the Americas and indeed around the world, I think it's safe to say that some of these cures are almost worse than the disease itself. Things like governments being put in a position where they can define what's fake and what's not. There are already cases such as in Venezuela and Nicaragua where legislation that is ostensibly meant to protect against misinformation is being used to silence the government's political opponents. So, Marcelo, if we can come back to you first on this one. I mean, from your perspective, of the toolkit that's kind of out there and available, what works, what might work, and what is a really bad idea?
Okay, let me start. Like, Cafi raised a very good point here. I think Carlos Affonso, sorry, Cafi, about the rear view mirror. And I think this is, well connected with the challenge. Brian, just a little bit before going to the solutions, talk a little bit about the challenge that we face and the platform. At Google here, for example, 15% of the queries of the daily queries that we have on search are new ones. Yes. So what that means, and that also I think relates to Carlos Affonso's point, is that we need to look to what it's coming, not what happened. Yes, of course we learn with the past as everybody else. Yes, but yes, the internet, it's an environment that it's on, it's a daily, it changes. It has daily changes. It moves every minute, and I think this poses one of the biggest challenges of fighting misinformation. In terms of solution, I think what we've done, I think it worked well, and this is something that we keep doing, and it's one of, as I said, the main pillars that we have is the work that we do with the Electoral, the partnership that we have since 2014 with the Electoral Court, which is a way to provide the users with the most accurate and official information about the voting process. But not only that, we also have partnership with other third parties, with the fact checkers, for example. Since 2018, also Google it's a big supporter of the Comprova effort, which is a pool of fact checkers and publishers, exactly to fact check information during the electoral process. And the third one, related to partnership, is something that we started three years ago, and that we strongly believe on. It's an effort on media literacy. We've been a big supporter of a media literacy program, which I believe is the biggest one that we have in Brazil. And this is also very important because we truly believe that we need to create, users and people that could read, think, and produce information in a critical way. Yes, it's important because right now we have this, again, the internet, the open internet brought us this possibility to share, to create, and to consume information in a way that we never saw before. But it's important also to create, share, and use that information on a critical way. And I think, like, in something that we really also believe, it's about transparency that Justice Barroso mentioned. And that's why we just brought to Brazil, we updated our policy, our political ads policy. And the idea is, since last month, every advertiser who will like to run electoral ads will need to be, will have to go through a verification process. And this is very important because with that information about this specific advertiser will be able to provide a transparency report on political ads that will contain information about how much money this advertiser had put on the specific ads, what the segmentation the advertiser used it, and also how many impressions these specific ads had. So I would say that we do have a lot of challenge, but we do believe to keep doing the work we have doing with third parties, with the partnerships, and we also believe to enhance our transparency on everything, but especially on electoral related issues.
All right, thank you, Marcelo. Let me just pause for a moment and invite those of you who are joining us for this event on the WebEx platform. You can submit your questions to us via the chat function on WebEx. Those of you who are watching us on the webcast via Twitter or live stream, you can do so just by replying underneath the video that you're watching right now, and we'll examine those, and if we have time, we'll ask the questions. Carlos, or was it Kafa? I hadn't heard that one yet. Your point is well taken about the need to look forward and not just backwards. It's actually a common criticism of militaries around the world too, is that generals are always fighting the last war instead of the current one. But as you look at the scenario right now and you think about some of the options that Marcelo just mentioned, what do you see as the most effective tools out there? And also, and I don't want this point to get lost, what is currently, and this is a question I'll make to Chris as well, what is out there right now in terms of proposed solutions to this problem that scares you in terms of legislation and other initiatives out there?
So thanks, Brian. I'll be super quick on what is not working. It looks like almost every single year down here in Brazil, our Congress tries to introduce a bill of law requiring, first of all, the identification of everyone that end up using social media, which is in Brazil, it's CPF, which will be something similar to Social Security number in the US. So with this idea that you have a clear connection between the name of someone using the social network and the identification number, that will make everything solved. So you'll be able to have a perfect view of who done what on the internet. And we know how this could very, very quickly trigger issues of surveillance and very serious restrictions on speech and how do people end up behaving online. A second fake solution, such to say, is to address the issue of traceability. And we've seen that in Brazil. We have right now a bill of law being discussed in the National Congress focusing on transparency and responsibility on the Brazilian internet. And one of the provisions that was in this draft bill of law was one focusing on traceability of messages sent through instant messaging app. And that's really a bad idea, because once you end up having a system like this one, you either will break end-to-end encryption, and that's a serious violation into privacy and data protection rights. And in the moment in which you have this type of system in place, then again, surveillance, especially when government wants to make use of what they end up finding in those messages, it's something that can be very quickly become something very dangerous. And the third solution that doesn't seem to me to be a solution is to have on federal law very strict rules on content moderation. And that's something that is very complex, but I really do believe that content moderation, if you need to have something on a federal law, needs to be something very, very principles-based, very on the structure, but not going to many details here, because different platforms will work out different ways in order to act on content and account moderation. And I'm really skeptical of us having that many details on a federal law on those issues. But it looks like those three solutions end up happening almost on a yearly basis in a national Congress in trying to address traceability of messages, identification of users on social media, and coming up with some master plan to solve content moderation that by the end of the day, content moderation is always more complex than what a federal law could get in abstract. And just to conclude, focusing on what we see out there, and this might sound a little bit odd coming from a lawyer, is that law will not solve this problem by itself. We need to look in a more complex way. So we see that some legislative reform might indeed be useful, but it needs to be cosmetic. Second, we need to address the economic aspects of it and trying to understand that disinformation is a business and that some people end up having a lot of profits taking out of disinformative content, and that there is an economic root that we need to address. Third, there is a social aspect to it. So media literacy, as Marcelo has said, is key to this aspect. And the fourth and the final aspect to this discussion is the technological one. Cristina has said that the way we fight disinformation is floating platforms with more information. That's true. But in order for that to work, the platform needs to be friendly to this floating of reliable and trustable information. So there is a technical aspect to it by the end of the day, which is design of the platforms to make sure that the trusted information end up reaching the users that are needed to be reached by this type of information. So just to say, I think we have those four aspects to consider.
Brian, do you mind if I jump in?
I was just going to come to you, and I was only going to preface it by saying, you know, it was important to us to have a diverse range of opinions on this panel, and so we have, you know, we have the private sector from technology companies, we have the legal perspective, which Carlos was just giving us, and of course, you come at this from the perspective of a journalist and a fact checker, and so on these questions of what works, what is potentially disastrous, what else is out there in the toolkit that might be effective going forward, please, the floor is yours.
Brian, you know what I think? I think, unfortunately, we spend too much time thinking about how to fight the bad and not thinking about how to help the good. We really need to create, let's say, a regulation or a bill of law, or call it the way you want it, to support the ones who are working to push the truth. We spend too much time trying to fight, the disinformers, the bad guys or girls. But we are actually missing the point that I keep saying every time I think I meet Minister Barroso. I keep saying we need to flood internet with good and reliable information. And I wonder why that's not a topic of discussion. Why we are not, instead of diagnosing the issue of falsehoods that we know for years and years, we're not spending time finding good solutions to push reliable information. I mean, if we're not willing to take that step, we're not even close to solving fake news issue here. I'm saying this because you mentioned already, we are only 50 fact checkers in Brazil. We are not enough. We will not be able to handle this. Yeah, we have managed, and I'm very grateful that TSE has taken a huge step and created a committee and brought platforms and fact checkers together, and has the zero rating website and is pushing content through its app, though many apps that they have, but we still need more. We still need, for example, to triple the size of fact-checking organizations to make sure that media and our media outlets are connected and collaborating. We need to make sure that parties are pushing reliable information. There are so many other ways that we can talk about misinformation. We are also always focused on taking down and removing instead of pushing good stuff. Yeah, there's this lack of conversation on this side of the problem that I'd love to get the conversation going. And I'm eager to say that, you know, Lupa has done a lot. ICFJ, where I'm working now, is doing a lot, but we are still just journalists. We need help for more people. And back to your question, things that are not working, and I completely agree with CAF. A legislation is a easy solution for a tough problem. It's not going to solve. And based on everything that fact checkers are studying since 2016, we can clearly tell, and I can guarantee you as a fact checker, the correlation between a law, a bill of law, and an approved law, and the reduce of falsehoods is not true. One thing is not going to cause the other. It's not. Which doesn't mean that we don't need to discuss this, but let's just drop this idea. This is unreal. This is again a falsehood. And this is not helping the discussion around the topic. What's something that might help? You asked before, Brian, and I think this is another hard conversation, and I'm happy to bring it because I'm always around for hard conversations. We really need to make it more difficult to share content. Yeah, it's too easy to spread whatever you want online. And I think this is a tough conversation. It could impact in business, it could impact in many other topics, but let's talk about it. What are the limitations? Should there be one or some?
Yeah, no, these are important points. And you mentioned, the fact that alternate solutions are available. And reading from, the issue that we put together, we did a feature looking at what governments are doing, and a lot of it was of dubious use. But one thing that caught my attention was in April 2019, in Uruguay, the 6 political parties with representatives in Congress signed an ethical pact against disinformation, pledging not to generate or promote false news or disinformation during the campaign. And this was proposed by the Uruguayan Press Association as part of a 3-pronged campaign against disinformation that also included training media professionals and a fact-checking tool. So I often express envy of Uruguay in my day-to-day work, even as someone who follows the whole hemisphere, including my own countries. I wish that such solution. I wish there was political support for that in many of our countries. To get to some of the questions that we got from the audience, here's an interesting one. Is regulating providers an option when anyone can operate a messaging app or social media platform without even being in a country? And this person points out the example of Telegram. And it is worth mentioning that there has been a documented migration of Brazilian messaging app users to Telegram over the last couple of weeks and months, precisely because they have understood that, and I believe this is true, that Telegram has no local operations in Brazil, and therefore they see it as kind of a safer space to quote unquote exercise their freedom of speech. A continuation of that question, is there any effort towards some kind of international standard? Is it unreasonable to think of something like a Paris Accord for the regulation and management of social media? Does anyone want to attempt to answer that one?
Ryan,
I think Carlos is the best person by far. No, Carlos, you are the best person by far.
No, I would just say that the very same bill of law that is being discussed in the National Congress has a provision, I'm afraid it's Article 2nd of the provision, that says that if you are a social media or instant messaging app and you have more than 2 million Brazilian users, you need to have some sort of representation in Brazil in order to operate in the country. So that could lead to the blocking of apps that do not comply with that provision. And that could be something that we'll be discussing in the near future, maybe Telegram being prohibited or blocked in Brazil if that provision ends up being approved into law.
Okay, here's another question. This one is directed toward Chris, and it's a good one. We've been focused on Brazil today, and I tried to explain over the course of the event why we've focused on Brazil, apart from the fact that it's the country or the region's largest democracy. But the question is for Chris. Chris, your portfolio now involves kind of a regional view of some of these issues. And the question points out, we have elections coming up in the next few weeks in Honduras, an election in Nicaragua that it cannot really be called an election. It's a sham election in which the dictator Ortega has sidelined his political opponents. But there's an election in Chile coming up as well. I mean, what have you observed in terms of misinformation trends in other countries? Is there anything that, as a Brazilian who's now living in the United States, kind of makes you say, that's a good idea. That looks like progress to me.
Brian, one thing, there is a good article that I co-published with Laura Solman from Chequeado, the fact checker in Argentina. And we talked about that. We talked about what are we seeing in the region in terms of mis and disinformation that, stands out as a common ground. So what we're seeing now is misinformation and disinformation are mainly attacking the electoral system in different nations right now. This is a trend. Like everybody's questioning whether the voting processes, if there is a fraud in counting the votes, whatever. That's a trending issue we will be seeing, and if not yet, in those countries. We are also seeing, it's very, very common to see when there isn't a clear winner, high level of personal attacks using mis and disinformation. So that is something that is all over. We've seen in different nations in not only Latin America, to be honest with you, it's something internationally taking place. And what we're seeing is, again, the encryptions, the encrypted universe is playing a big role. And this is making fact-checking a tougher issue.
So thank you for that. We have about 5 minutes left. I want to squeeze in 2 more questions before we break. The first one is for Marcelo. Marcelo, the question is basically, what support do you see as necessary from governments, for the private sector, for tech companies, as they try to combat this issue, as they try to reduce misinformation? What kind of support would be helpful from political actors?
Right. As we spoke here, this is a complex issue that has so many layers in terms of, actors, motivations, goals, even financial resources and things like that. So the way that we as Google see this is that this should be a common goal from different sectors of society. So publishers, tech companies, academia, fact checkers, the government in its different forms, like the Congress, the executive branch, and also the courts. They all should have this common goal of fighting disinformation and make sure that the reliable and official and trustful information will prevent upon what it's not true or it's not accurate. I think Cristina brought a very good point that we truly believe also. We truly believe that internet brought a huge opportunity for everybody. Yes. So we should not stop that opportunity. We should enhance that opportunity and make sure that it works promptly with good information, helpful information for the users. So in terms of, to be very objective with the answer, I think it's not a support, it's a partnership. What we look for, it's partnership between those different actors from society towards a common goal of making this type of information less visible than the accurate one.
Thank you, Marcelo. Chris, I want to give the final word to you. And sometimes at these events we try a little too hard to finish on an optimistic note. And I actually, there's a story here that you told me that is, I think, a genuine cause for optimism when you were on the America's Quarterly podcast last week. We talked over the course, Minister Barroso mentioned it, you mentioned it, Carlos mentioned it, this idea of education and trying to sort of get people to be more discerning about what they consume. And you told me a story about the truckers in Brazil that actually left me. That was one of those moments where I said, whoa, actually, maybe there is positive change happening here. Can you just briefly, in the 2 minutes that we have left, try to tell everybody what that was about?
Sure, Brian. I'm writing about this right now because I'm optimistic, and I want to share this thing with you all. We are learning. We have learned a lot, and I think the most striking proof of that is the case that Brian you just mentioned, is the day when truck drivers in Brazil were heading towards a strike, a big strike, and they got a WhatsApp audio but from President Bolsonaro asking them to stop and go back to work. And actually, they didn't trust it. They were aware of the fact that you cannot trust a audio that goes to you on WhatsApp. You know, it was amazing to see this kind of professional being already conscious about the importance and the need to verify content. And I jumped at this high, Brian, when I saw that. I'm like, this is amazing. We finally got different people around the country to understand how falsehoods can be dangerous and to be ready to just question yourself, is this really true? It's amazing. It's a huge, huge step.
Yeah, I think we've all learned the hard way over the last couple years. Did you have something to add, Marcelo?
Yes, I do have, and I'm also an optimist like Cristina, and it's an ongoing process, and we are learning a lot, and I think this type of discussion, that what will bring us to a better place. And just to also give you an example, and this is public, it was published last year in a newspaper. We saw the news about the president Bolsonaro talking about vaccines and AIDS. Yes, and what we saw on Google Trends, it was a spike on search exactly about those topics. What I mean is that, once the people will use also our tool and other tools, not only the online platforms, but also offline tools. What I mean is that people start getting to, understand better what they receive as information. Yes, checking the information, be your own fact checker also. Use all the tools that we have, not the online platforms, but the newspapers, the fact checkers, the academians. We have so many. Let's use what we have right now. This so many different sources of information to also understand better the information that we receive. I think, just to end on a positive note, I'm also an optimist because, people are learning. We are all learning.
I think we all are. I mean, I have shared a couple of things over the years accidentally that were false, and you have to be skeptical. That's somebody who was a journalist for 20 years. You can imagine, truckers and other folks out there in the world. It's something we've all had to learn. So Marcelo, Chris, Carlos, Mr. Barroso, who was with us, thank you so much for joining us. For more, go to our website, americasquarterly.org, where you can watch a replay of this event, as well as pour through some of the material that we put together on this issue. To all of you, thank you so much for joining us, and have a good day.